The president angry about Canada's new digital services tax. The president, as you see right there, calling it, quote, a direct and blatant attack on our country.
Carney was created by Donald Trump, and now he's his worst nightmare.
President Trump has pulled the plug. Just days after shaking hands at the G7, he abruptly ended trade talks with Canada, calling their new digital tax a blatant attack and promising new tariffs within 7 days. While Trump escalated the fight, Canada didn't flinch. Instead, Prime Minister Mark Carney played a quiet but deliberate card, one that could turn this trade dispute into something much bigger. Let's unpack what's happening behind the scenes and whether Canada can hold its ground or be forced to fold.
You know, there are different means that we could have delayed the implementation. The Prime Minister has wide powers to do these things, as does the Finance Minister. I think this may also have been a negotiating tactic on the part of Prime Minister Carney.
On June 28th, Canada officially began collecting its long-planned digital services tax, targeting major American tech companies like Google, Meta, and Amazon. The tax wasn't new. It had been legislated in 2024, debated since 2019, and structured to apply retroactively from January 2022. Carney could have delayed the payment deadline. He had the legal authority, but instead, he chose to proceed, fully aware that Trump would treat it as provocation. Insiders in Ottawa now call it a negotiating tactic, not a misstep, but a deliberate pushback. It was Canada saying, "We won't be bullied into silence." In dollar terms, this digital tax is modest. Canada expects to collect around 2 billion Canadian dollars in total, barely a fraction of the $800 billion in annual bilateral trade with the US. But for Carney, this wasn't about revenue. It was about setting boundaries, establishing that Canada has the right to tax global firms operating on its soil. Former finance officials now say, if needed, Canada could freeze or repeal the tax. But doing so without any US compromise would carry domestic political costs and send a dangerous signal of submission. Trump labeled the tax an attack. Carney treated it as leverage.
We're a natural resource superpower. If we're backed into a corner, we can use those to our advantage.
Trump insists the US holds all the cards. But Canada does have leverage, especially if things escalate. It supplies over 90% of the potash used by US farmers. It's a critical source of natural gas feedstock for American fertilizer production, and it controls key supplies of uranium and critical minerals, vital for defense and clean energy sectors. Canada also has trade options. Carney recently signed strategic deals with the European Union, and his government is actively expanding ties with India, China, and Southeast Asia, regions that, according to the IMF, will drive 1/3 of global GDP growth by 2027. But there's another side to this coin: economic pain at home.
Trade tensions stalled momentum in Canada's economic growth this spring and put a chill on business investment, hiring, and consumer confidence.
According to Deloitte Canada, the country is now on track for a mild recession. The report forecasts 2 quarters of negative GDP growth, driven in part by prolonged US tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and autos. Job creation has stalled. The hardest-hit sectors, manufacturing and auto, are already cutting back. And consumer confidence is dropping, dragging down housing sales and spending across the board. Even with interest rates at 2.75% and a likely cut from the Bank of Canada this summer, the economic outlook remains fragile. So the question is, with pressure rising, how long can Canada hold the line? Mark Carney faces a narrow path. He could withdraw the digital tax tomorrow. That might satisfy Trump, but it would undercut Canada's policy sovereignty and validate Washington's pressure campaign. Or he could hold steady and risk deeper tariffs that could ripple across Canadian industry. But Carney isn't playing to win a headline. He's trying to shape the long game: less exposure to US retaliation, more resilience through diversification. Trump wants a quick deal. Carney is building insulation.
And when the president said, maybe we'll make Canada another state, he said, no, we absolutely will never do that.
This isn't just a spat over a tax. It's a test of strategy, leverage, and national resolve. Trump believes pressure always pays, but this time, Canada didn't blink. They played their card, and now they're waiting. The tariff letter is coming. And when it does, the real question won't be what's in it, but whether Canada backs down or shows Trump that even the small guys have cards worth playing.
Canada, they were foolish to do it. So I said we're going to stop all negotiations with Canada right now until they straighten out their act.
U.S. President Donald Trump repeating his rhetoric over Canada becoming the 51st state, days after saying trade negotiations between the two countries have ended.
It started with a sentence. President Trump declared, "We're done talking." In one abrupt move, he ended trade negotiations with Canada, America's closest neighbor and longest-standing ally. It wasn't just about taxes. It wasn't just about trade. What followed was something far more provocative. Trump said,
"We will be fine with Canada. I love Canada. Frankly, Canada should be the 51st state."
The shock wasn't just in the statement, it was in the timing, the tone, and the threat that came right after. New tariffs, 7 days, and zero room for compromise.
You know, this policy actually was introduced by the previous administration in Canada. It was bad policy then, and it's bad policy now. And now Carney has no income, so he's trying to find any way he can to make income.
At the center of the explosion was a tax, a 3% levy on digital services, introduced by Canada and set to take effect on July 1st. It targets major U.S. tech giants like Google, Amazon, and Meta. Investor Kevin O'Leary described the tax as a desperate measure, pointing to Trudeau-era energy restrictions as the root of Canada's revenue crisis. Though long in the making, planned since 2019 and passed into law in 2024, it was the moment of collection that triggered Trump's fury. According to estimates from Canada's Parliamentary Budget Office, this tax could bring in nearly $7 billion over 5 years. Trump didn't just oppose it, he viewed it as an attack, one that demanded immediate retaliation. And so, he slammed the brakes on all trade talks, warning that tariffs would be imposed on key Canadian exports within the week. But this wasn't just about big tech, it was about power, politics, and old grudges.
It's pure Trump. It's the way he negotiates. He throws live munitions at something and he hopes that something in his favor will come of it.
Trump has never hidden his disdain for Canada's supply management system, a framework that protects dairy, poultry, and egg farmers through quotas and price controls. It was a sticking point in the original NAFTA talks, and despite being enshrined in the USMCA agreement Trump himself signed, he's now calling it unfair. Then came the metals. Steel and aluminum are back in the firing line, industries that have seen tariffs rise and fall multiple times since 2018. To Trump, Canada is a dependent partner who enjoys U.S. market access without paying its dues. That's the justification he gives, not just for trade penalties, but for something even more dramatic. By suggesting Canada become the 51st state, Trump is using the language of absorption to assert dominance. Critics call it rhetorical theater. But for Trump, it's a power play, and it's a move designed to force a response.
You know, no one takes seriously here in the United States his talk about the 51st state, but he does seem to be using it as a form of leverage, or hoping that it could be used as leverage to get what he perceives to be a better deal.
While Trump turns up the volume, Canada turns inward. Prime Minister Mark Carney has avoided direct confrontation. Behind closed doors, senior officials continue quiet outreach to Washington, trying to salvage some path forward. The Canadian government shows no signs of abandoning its agricultural protections, a red line in every negotiation. But the digital services tax? That's another matter. Sources within the Canadian Finance Ministry, speaking on background to local media, have acknowledged the DST may be flexible if it leads to a broader deal. Meanwhile, Trump is under pressure. His 90 deals in 90 days campaign is running out of time before the July 9th deadline. His signature spending bill, nicknamed the Big Beautiful Bill, faces resistance in the Senate. And even Elon Musk, once a close ally, is publicly criticizing his economic priorities. Trump needs a win. Canada, for now, refuses to hand him one. So what's next? If Canada caves on the DST, a reset in negotiations is possible. If they hold the line, Trump could follow through on tariffs that would hit Canadian steel, aluminum, and dairy, damaging sectors already under pressure from inflation and slowing global demand. But the deeper risk is strategic. Trump isn't just testing Canada, he's testing the boundaries of trade diplomacy itself, turning up pressure, making personal demands, blurring the line between economic and political integration. In this high-stakes standoff, there are no easy outcomes. But one truth is clear. Trump is not negotiating for just a trade deal. He's negotiating for leverage, legacy, and the illusion of control. And while markets react and headlines swirl, it's workers, consumers, and families on both sides of the border who will carry the cost.
Did you pick the 2029 review because Donald Trump will be out of office?
Will he be out of office? Oh,
in January,
I didn't
yes.
realize that. Okay. Look, it's a natural time to review. We'll have enough information at that point.
This June, President Trump stood at the NATO summit and claimed a major win. He had pushed America's allies to raise their defense spending to 5% of GDP, and they agreed. It was the kind of stage Trump thrives on, bold, loud, and all eyes on him. But while the spotlight stayed on Washington, something else happened. Canada, led by Prime Minister Mark Carney, quietly charted a different path. Not through confrontation, but through alignment. And it could reshape North America's economic future.
To have maximum spillovers, like benefits in Canada of that spending to get jobs and others.
Trump entered the NATO summit with a singular message: pay up. Under his pressure, member states agreed to raise defense spending from the long-standing 2% benchmark to 5% of GDP by 2035. It was the headline he wanted. It echoed across U.S. news cycles. He framed it as a victory for American leadership and his own deal-making skills. But while Trump was praising NATO's commitment, Canada was making another move.
That's part of the reason why we're cooperating more closely with the Europeans.
Carney wasn't just there to shake hands. He was there to signal a shift. On the sidelines of the NATO meeting, Canada and the European Union signed a sweeping security and industrial agreement. It covered defense procurement, energy cooperation, and joint development of critical infrastructure. No big press splash, no bragging tweets. But it was a statement, loud in its subtlety. Canada wasn't waiting for U.S. leadership. It was building alternatives. Just weeks earlier, at the G7 in Kananaskis, Trump gave Canada an ultimatum. He demanded a bilateral trade deal within 30 days or face increased tariffs. At the time, Canada was already under a 25% tariff on most exports to the U.S. and 50% on steel and aluminum. Carney didn't push back directly. Instead, he doubled down on Canada's partnership with Europe. While Trump kept touting his 90 deals in 90 days initiative, Canada quietly signed a strategic pact with the EU, locking in military and industrial cooperation. Meanwhile, the US-Canada deal? Still nowhere near finished. By late June, only 2 frameworks had been signed under Trump's tariff blitz, one with the UK and one with China. And Canada, America's largest trading partner, was already warning it could escalate retaliatory tariffs by mid-July if talks failed. Trump may have been trying to corner Canada at the G7. But Carney turned that pressure into leverage and made Washington look isolated.
Do you feel more comfortable in Brussels than in Washington?
A few days later, at the EU-Canada summit in Brussels, the contrast grew sharper. During a joint press event, Carney was asked a loaded question: whether he felt more comfortable in Brussels than in Washington. He answered with a smile.
Well, in terms of relative comfort, well, it's very hot in Washington right now and very humid. I'm sure the dinner will be better.
But his message was clear. Canada and Europe, he said, share values on labor rights, sustainability, and defending democracy, especially in Ukraine. He highlighted Europe's 18th sanctions package against Russia, which Canada supported with its own financial sanctions and military aid. He confirmed Canada would join the EU-led Ukraine Reconstruction Conference and had just approved new arms shipments to Kyiv. At no point did Carney criticize the U.S. He didn't have to. By emphasizing shared values, shared action, and shared burdens, he let the contrast speak for itself. Trump's world is one of deals, pressure, and dominance. Carney's message? Coalitions, long-term vision, and quiet power. And when it came to defense procurement, Canada was already in talks to buy fighter jets and submarines from European partners. No American suppliers mentioned. Trump thought he held the upper hand, with tariffs, pressure, and public ultimatums. But Mark Carney didn't fight back on Trump's terms. He built a broader alliance, one that didn't need Washington's permission. And as Canada pivots toward Europe, one question remains. Is Trump still leading, or is he being left behind?